In August 2025, the trade war between the US and India escalated as the Trump administration decided to impose a 50% tariff on all goods imported from India. This move certainly caught the attention of the world. However, the consequences of this decision went beyond price increases and typical trade disruptions. It led to the collapse of the US pharmaceutical industry. The event prompted strong reactions from both India and China, as these two major countries decided to cut off the supply of essential medications to the US. Now, millions of families in America are faced with the harsh choice of paying for medication or keeping a roof over their heads. Stay tuned to the video to better understand the far-reaching impacts of this trade war on the pharmaceutical industry and what's really happening behind the scenes. What do you think about Trump's administration decision in this trade war? Was raising tariffs the right choice? Comment 1 if you agree with this decision, or 0 if you disagree. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our latest videos. Let's explore this story together. The trade war between the US and India began in August 2025 with a shocking decision from the Trump administration. The imposition of a 50% tariff on all goods imported from India not only sent shockwaves through the country's manufacturing and export sectors, but also had unexpected consequences on the lives of millions of Americans. In this context, the pharmaceutical industry, particularly the supply of generic medicines from India, became the epicenter of the crisis. India has long been one of the largest suppliers of generic drugs to the US, with billions of dollars worth of medications being exported each year. These drugs, mainly used to treat chronic conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, and infections, not only helped reduce treatment costs for the American public, but also played a significant role in maintaining the healthcare system. However, when the 50% tariff was imposed, Indian pharmaceutical companies faced enormous challenges. Production costs increased, and exporting to the US became economically unfeasible. The immediate impact of this move was a severe shortage of critical medications at pharmacies across the US. The pharmaceutical supply chain was disrupted, leaving many patients unable to access the medications they relied on for treating dangerous and chronic illnesses. This led to a healthcare crisis right on US soil, where citizens began to feel the direct effects of political decisions. The unforeseen consequence of this trade war was that millions of American families were forced to make a difficult choice: pay for medication or pay the rent. Patients with chronic conditions, who depend on daily medication to maintain their health, now found themselves in a situation where they couldn't access the medications or had to pay exorbitant prices. Many had to temporarily stop their treatment, resulting in severe health repercussions. This scenario not only sparked a wave of criticism toward the US government, but also exposed a harsh truth. In a trade war, the most vulnerable, the patients in need of medicine, end up paying the highest price. From an event that seemed to only affect trade and finance, this trade war revealed a much larger issue: America's dependence on foreign pharmaceutical supplies and the fragility of its healthcare system. The lesson here is that in a globalized world, political and economic decisions not only affect big corporations, but also directly impact the lives of millions of people. Especially when we are not adequately prepared for major changes in global supply chains, healthcare issues become an unavoidable factor. The importance of global supply chains. In the modern world, global supply chains are not only about everyday consumer goods, but also about life-saving sectors like healthcare. Trade decisions such as imposing tariffs can disrupt the drug supply system, leading to a healthcare crisis. This shows that we need to better understand our dependence on other countries for essential products, especially in the pharmaceutical field. The value of domestic healthcare systems. One key lesson from this crisis is that nations need to focus on developing their own healthcare systems and reduce dependence on external suppliers. The lack of domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities or failure to develop pharmaceutical technology creates significant risks if there are any disruptions in international supply chains. The consequences of political decisions on public health. The trade war between the US and India is a stark example of how political decisions can have far-reaching effects on public health. trade policies must be carefully considered to avoid harming vulnerable groups in society. The health of the public cannot be sacrificed for short-term economic goals. The need for consumer protection policies. In the context of this pharmaceutical crisis, it is clear that the government must have effective consumer protection policies, especially in critical sectors like healthcare. Measures to protect citizens' rights, such as controlling drug prices, ensuring a stable drug supply, and supporting patients who cannot access medicine, must be implemented. The long-term impact of trade wars. The trade war is not just about imposing tariffs. It also creates long-lasting and widespread impacts on the economy and the lives of people. Nations need to view this issue holistically and prepare for the long-term consequences it may bring. The US-India trade war has created unimaginable consequences. From tariff increases to drug shortages, this crisis has shown that political decisions are inextricably linked to the lives of individuals in society. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of a strong healthcare system and the need to prepare for major shifts in global supply chains. The lesson from this war is that, no matter how much countries argue about trade, it is the citizens who ultimately bear the heaviest burden. When the Trump administration imposed a 50% tariff on all goods imported from India in August 2025, many expected a strong response from the Indian government. However, instead of confronting the US directly through public measures or diplomatic tensions, India opted for a more subtle strategy aimed at creating an impact without escalating the political situation. The Indian government did not make any official statements, but instead implemented changes in the pharmaceutical supply chain. They slowed down production and extended delivery times, causing pharmaceutical shipments to the US to be delayed without any formal notice. This was a smart, yet tactful move, allowing India to express its opposition without heightening political tensions. The slowdown in production and the disruption of the pharmaceutical supply chain led to a severe crisis in the US. As one of the largest suppliers of generic drugs to the American market, India had been providing up to 40% of the generic drugs used in the US as essential medicines like antibiotics, insulin, blood pressure medications, and cancer treatments, which were lifelines for millions of American patients, were now in short supply. This disruption not only affected patients, but also plunged the US healthcare system into crisis, particularly for those who rely on long-term treatments. Diabetic patients, people with high blood pressure, and cancer patients, who had previously had easy access to affordable medications, were now facing significant shortages, or had to buy medications at much higher prices from domestic producers. To understand the gravity of the situation, we need to consider why India plays such a critical role in the global pharmaceutical industry, especially for the US. India is not only one of the largest pharmaceutical producers in the world, but also a major supplier of generic drugs to international markets, including the US. Generic drugs are copies of expensive brand-name medications, but they have the same quality and are sold at a much lower price. One of the key factors that allows India to produce drugs so affordably is its low production costs, especially labor and raw materials. According to estimates, drugs made in India can be up to 70% cheaper than producing the same drugs in the US. This has allowed millions of American families, especially those with low to middle incomes, to access life-saving medications without facing financial burdens. By reducing the cost of medications, India not only helped lower costs for consumers, but also enabled hospitals and healthcare facilities to provide better services without worrying about rising costs. However, when the supply chain was disrupted due to the US tariff policy, American families and patients not only faced drug shortages, but also had to deal with skyrocketing drug prices. This not only affected those with chronic illnesses, but also caused a shock to the entire national healthcare system, especially since generic drugs from India accounted for a significant portion of the market. Dependence on global pharmaceutical supply chains. This crisis highlighted America's dependence on other countries, especially India, for drug supplies. The lack of contingency plans for such situations has made the US healthcare system vulnerable to international political and trade fluctuations. The importance of generic drugs. Generic drugs play a crucial role in maintaining public health by reducing the financial burden on citizens. A shortage of generic drugs can create a serious situation, forcing millions of people to choose between buying medicine and facing other financial hardships. The need for a more sustainable drug supply system. To prevent similar risks in the future, the U.S. needs to develop a more sustainable drug supply system, which includes investing in domestic drug production and seeking reliable pharmaceutical partners beyond countries that rely on a single source. The impact of trade policies on public health. Trade policies cannot only be viewed from an economic perspective. The effects on public health must also be considered. The government needs to make careful decisions, ensuring that economic development is not achieved at the expense of citizens' well-being, especially in critical areas like healthcare. The beginning of this pharmaceutical crisis serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of global supply chains and the need to protect essential elements like medicines and healthcare services. While trade policies may bring short-term economic benefits, failing to consider the long-term consequences on public health can make millions of people pay a high price. The question is whether the government and policymakers can learn from this crisis and implement necessary changes to protect citizens in the future. As the trade war between the U.S. and India continued to escalate, its effects began to spread throughout the United States, but not in the way many had imagined. While this crisis wasn't loudly reported in the media, its consequences were deeply felt, particularly by patients who rely on long-term medication. With the supply of drugs being cut off, essential medicines like insulin, blood pressure medications, antibiotics, and cancer treatments became scarce, and patients faced unimaginable price hikes for their medications. Millions of patients across the U.S. were confronted with a healthcare crisis that was not loud but profoundly serious. As the medications they depended on became inaccessible, they had no choice but to find ways to cope. Many had to split their medications into smaller doses to save money, or worse, stop their treatments altogether. Some patients even had to halt their treatment due to unaffordable costs, leading to increased health risks and emergency situations. The most vulnerable groups, such as the elderly, those with diabetes or cancer patients, suffered the most in this crisis. They not only faced the physical pain of their illnesses, but also battled a greater fear: whether they could afford their treatment. A sad example is the story of John, a 76-year-old man from Texas. He suffers from cardiovascular disease and needs daily medication to survive. Before the crisis, he paid only $28 per month for his heart medication. However, within a month, the price of the medication soared to $91, an amount he could no longer afford. The desperation of seeing medication prices even higher than his rent forced him to make a painful decision: either stop the medication or cut back on other essential expenses. John's story is just one of countless similar situations unfolding across the U.S. People were not only dealing with skyrocketing drug prices, but also with a shortage of essential medications. This created an extremely difficult situation for those with underlying conditions, who needed daily medication to stay alive. As the situation grew dire, the U.S. government could not stand by while its citizens suffered. Officials in Washington began calling emergency meetings to find ways to address the pharmaceutical crisis. However, all attempts to fix the situation in the short term were unsuccessful. The drug shortages and skyrocketing prices created an emergency that could not be immediately fixed. While cutting taxes or changing trade policies might help alleviate the situation, it couldn't immediately erase the serious consequences the crisis had caused. As the U.S. government worked to address the issue, it also faced a shortage of pharmaceutical supplies from major drug-producing countries, particularly India. Although some policies were proposed to help the public, due to the urgent nature of the situation and the complexity of international supply chain issues, the U.S. government could not resolve the situation in the short term. Furthermore, the instability in the global pharmaceutical system only added to the difficulty in finding long-term solutions. Dependence on foreign drug supplies. This crisis highlighted America's deep dependence on other countries, particularly India, for its drug supplies. When the supply chain was disrupted, the lack of essential medications quickly led to a domestic emergency. This also emphasized the need for developing domestic pharmaceutical industries to minimize risks from international fluctuations. The impact of rising drug prices on people's lives. When drug prices soared, low and middle-income families became the hardest hit. This serves as a lesson for the government and health regulatory bodies on the need for price controls to protect the public from unreasonable and unjustified price hikes. The vulnerability of the healthcare system. This crisis also revealed the fragility of the U.S. healthcare system, which has become overly dependent on imported medications. The government and healthcare facilities need to have contingency plans for such emergencies to ensure that citizens do not have to suffer from drug shortages or face insurmountable financial burdens. The need for effective consumer protection policies. To avoid similar situations in the future, policies protecting consumers, especially in healthcare, need to be carefully reviewed and strongly implemented. Vulnerable groups, such as the elderly and those with chronic conditions, need to be shielded from the unpredictable effects of political and economic decisions. This pharmaceutical crisis is not only a warning about drug shortages, but also a reminder of the vulnerability of the healthcare system and the heavy reliance on global pharmaceutical supplies. Although the government has taken initial steps in response, the situation cannot be fixed immediately. Millions of Americans, especially those with chronic illnesses, continue to struggle with a quiet but difficult battle to access necessary medications. The pharmaceutical crisis caused by the trade war between the U.S. and India not only disrupted the drug supply, but also served as a serious warning about the weakness and fragility of the U.S. healthcare system. This crisis wasn't just a temporary incident that could be quickly fixed. It was a clear sign that an essential part of the healthcare system was under severe threat. When 40% of generic drugs disappeared from the market, not only low-income individuals, but also millions of middle-class patients were faced with a severe shortage of medications. This was not just a shock to the public, but also a turning point in the trust they had placed in the U.S. healthcare system. The pharmaceutical crisis highlighted something that many had long suspected. The U.S. healthcare system is not always sustainable, especially when it relies too much on external sources, like generic drugs from India. The sudden shortage of drugs exposed the fragility of a healthcare system already grappling with issues such as high costs, unequal access to healthcare services, and instability in insurance policies. This warning is not limited to the pharmaceutical sector, but encompasses broader issues about how the U.S. manages its healthcare system. Global supply chain disruptions could accelerate the collapse of already weak structures. The sudden disappearance of 40% of generic drugs from the U.S. market created a huge shock for the public, making them lose faith in the healthcare system they had trusted for decades. For patients who rely on medication to stay alive, the shortage of drugs was not just a health issue, but a major blow to their trust in health authorities and the government. Millions of people faced a painful reality. What they once thought was reliable and dependable could be upended at any moment due to political and economic factors. For many, this felt like a betrayal from a system they expected to protect their health. The loss of trust didn't stop with the public. It spread to hospitals, doctors, and healthcare providers. Those working in healthcare, already facing financial and resource challenges, now had to confront a bigger problem: how to provide medication to patients when the supply was cut off. Healthcare facilities, especially public hospitals, struggled to maintain service quality while lacking essential medications. This was a challenge that couldn't be solved in the short term and would create long-term instability for the entire healthcare system. Even more concerning, this crisis affected not only the poor and low-income patients, but also highlighted a serious vulnerability in the U.S. healthcare system. Chronic patients, those who depend on daily medications, and the elderly were left behind when they couldn't access essential medicines. However, the issue was not just the drug shortages, but also the profound shift in how people viewed the country's healthcare system. This system, already criticized for its high costs and inequality in service distribution, now faced a crisis of trust, one that could be impossible to repair for a long time. This crisis also reflects a larger issue. Has the U.S. healthcare system become too reliant on foreign sources and lacks the capacity to be self-sufficient when significant disruptions occur in global supply chains? The lesson here is clear. In an increasingly globalized world, no country can rely solely on others for life-essential products like medications, and must develop a stronger domestic system to safeguard the health of its citizens. Healthcare system autonomy needed. This crisis serves as a warning that nations need to have a more autonomous healthcare system, one that is not overly dependent on other countries for essential medications and healthcare services. This helps reduce risks when unexpected changes occur in the international environment. Protecting public trust. Losing trust in the healthcare system can have long-lasting effects on public health. Governments must implement measures to protect the public's trust in healthcare systems, ensuring that political decisions do not compromise their health. Ensuring stability in the healthcare supply chain. Nations must invest in maintaining and developing domestic pharmaceutical supply chains, while also ensuring stability in international supply chains. This will guarantee that people always have access to essential medicines and healthcare services without disruptions. The pharmaceutical crisis is not just a temporary event. It is a profound crisis that reflects deeper issues within the U.S. healthcare system. The loss of trust and the instability in accessing medications have created a wave of concern in society. This is a crucial lesson on building a sustainable and self-reliant healthcare system, protecting citizens from political and economic fluctuations that could impact their health. What do you think about this crisis? Do you think the U.S. healthcare system needs to change and become more self-reliant? Leave a 1 if you agree, or 0 if you have a different opinion about this story. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a sub to support us. Now let's continue following the next developments in this story. As the trade war between the U.S. and India escalated, particularly after the U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on all goods imported from India, India decided to wisely adjust its strategy and direction. Instead of confronting the U.S. directly or engaging in an overt trade war, India chose to shift its focus and expand trade relations with other countries. This not only helped India mitigate the impact of the sanctions, but also created a significant opportunity to strengthen its global influence. India began building stronger ties with major economies like Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa. This move not only helped India find new markets for goods and pharmaceuticals, but also reduced its dependence on a single trade partner, particularly the U.S. These countries, especially China and Russia, are key strategic partners in maintaining global supply chain stability, including in the pharmaceutical industry. India's shift in pharmaceutical exports created a major change in the global drug supply network, directly impacting the U.S. Previously, the U.S. had been heavily reliant on India for generic drugs, critical medications that help reduce healthcare costs for millions of Americans. However, as India expanded its trade relations with other nations, the U.S. market faced significant disruptions. Essential drugs like insulin, antibiotics, cancer treatments, and blood pressure medications started to become scarce. Patients were not only faced with rising drug prices, but also had to endure shortages of basic medications. These consequences not only caused a healthcare crisis, but also sparked a wave of discontent among the American public, particularly among those with chronic illnesses who depend on medications to stay alive. India's strategic shift did not just disrupt the drug supply, but also removed a crucial component from the global healthcare network that the U.S. had long depended on. This once again exposed the fragility of the U.S. healthcare system, which had already been struggling with issues like high healthcare costs and drug shortages. But India didn't stop at just changing its drug export strategy. The country also began to build its own healthcare belt to reduce dependence on the U.S. and other Western nations for pharmaceutical production. This meant that India was creating a more independent and sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing system, while simultaneously expanding its influence in the global pharmaceutical industry. The creation of this healthcare belt was not limited to drug production, but also included developing research and development, R&D facilities within the pharmaceutical industry. These R&D centers helped India enhance its innovation and improve drug formulations while minimizing reliance on other nations for technology and raw materials. India also started signing trade agreements with Asian and African countries, regions with high demand for medicines and healthcare services. This not only increased India's economic influence, but also ensured that it would not be dependent on a single market. India was creating a diverse international network, which helped strengthen the stability and sustainability of its pharmaceutical sector. The need for preparation for major changes in global supply chains. This crisis once again demonstrated that excessive reliance on a single country or supplier could pose great risks for any nation. The US and other countries need to diversify their supply chains and avoid dependence on nations outside their borders. Adaptability and flexibility in national strategy. India has shown great flexibility in changing its strategy and expanding its trade relations. The country not only maintained its position in the pharmaceutical industry, but also seized the opportunity to increase its international influence, expand markets, and build an independent manufacturing system. Other countries can learn from this strategy in adapting to changes in the international environment. The importance of developing domestic pharmaceutical industries. A key lesson from India is that developing a domestic pharmaceutical industry is critical to reducing reliance on other nations and protecting public health. Countries need to invest in research and development to create quality, competitive pharmaceutical products. India's strategic shift in the pharmaceutical industry is not just a response to US trade policies, but a calculated move to solidify its position and expand its global influence. By building its own healthcare belt and diversifying trade partners, India is not only reducing reliance on the US, but also laying a strong foundation for sustainable growth in the global pharmaceutical sector. The consequences for the US are undeniable, as the country loses a crucial part of its pharmaceutical supply chain and faces severe challenges in maintaining the stability of its healthcare system. The trade war between the US and India not only caused significant disruptions in the pharmaceutical sector, but also had a powerful impact on the technology industry, particularly on giants like Apple. As one of the companies heavily dependent on India for assembling and manufacturing iPhones, Apple was hit hard by the Trump administration's imposition of a 50% tariff on all goods imported from India. This move not only disrupted Apple's supply chain, but also forced the company to confront a series of unprecedented challenges. Apple, with its global production strategy, had invested billions of dollars in India to expand its manufacturing base and take advantage of low labor costs. India was not only the main assembly hub for iPhone models, but also a crucial part of Apple's global strategy, enabling the company to maintain competitive pricing and meet consumer demand worldwide. However, when the 50% tariff was imposed on all goods imported from India, Apple faced a series of serious issues. This tariff hike not only increased the cost of products, but also reduced the company's profit margins, directly affecting its business operations in the US and international markets. With rising production costs and an uncertain future, Apple was forced to adjust its manufacturing strategy. Relying on India had now become a major risk factor, as Apple's supply chain could be disrupted at any time. While Apple began exploring alternative partners in countries like Vietnam and China, this transition was neither quick nor easy, and it would take time. Moreover, the relationship between Apple and the Indian government started to face tension due to changes in trade policies and tariffs, making it increasingly difficult for the company to continue stable operations in India. Apple had invested in India for years, building manufacturing facilities and long-term partnerships. But the trade war and the new tariffs forced the company to reconsider all of its current business strategies. These changes not only threatened Apple's supply chain, but could also diminish the company's global competitiveness, particularly as rivals sought to increase production in other regions. The US-India trade war didn't just affect Apple, but also had a profound impact on the entire US technology industry. Other tech companies began feeling the effects of high tariffs and instability in the supply chain. Many companies, especially those with production lines dependent on other countries, were forced to find alternative solutions to minimize the impact of tariffs. However, transitioning production away from India or other countries presented numerous challenges, from cost to time required to make the change. While the US tech industry has always been known for its innovation and resilience, this crisis revealed a significant issue: excessive dependence on global supply chains, particularly from low-cost countries like India. When supply chains are disrupted, not only do tech companies suffer, but the entire US economy faces major challenges. The shortage of products, skyrocketing costs, and disruptions in production not only weakened the US's position in the tech industry, but also reduced its global economic competitiveness. Global supply chain dependence as a major risk. This crisis highlighted an issue that many companies hadn't fully realized. Reliance on international supply chains can be a decisive factor in a business's survival. Without contingency plans and preparation for disruptions, companies can face significant losses. The need for diversified and sustainable supply sources. Companies, especially in the tech industry, need to find ways to diversify their supply chains to reduce the risks from political and economic changes. Building a flexible and sustainable supply chain will help businesses adapt to global fluctuations more easily. The need for domestic manufacturing investment in the U.S. One key lesson from this crisis is the need to invest in domestic manufacturing. While transitioning production back to the U.S. may be more expensive, it could be a strategic move to reduce the impact of tariffs and future supply chain disruptions. The widespread impact of trade wars on the economy. This crisis also serves as a reminder of the far-reaching consequences that trade decisions can have on the economy. Industries cannot survive in an unstable environment, and sustainable development cannot be maintained without stable global supply chains. Apple's crisis is not just a story of one company. It signals a larger problem: the severe consequences of overdependence on other nations. The U.S. technology industry, once a symbol of innovation and growth, now faces major challenges as global supply chains are disrupted. Finding alternative solutions and developing a more sustainable manufacturing strategy is not only key for Apple to overcome this crisis, but also a valuable lesson for the entire tech industry and the U.S. economy in this era of globalization. Thank you all for watching the video till the end. If you found this content interesting, don't forget to like, share the video to spread the word, and subscribe to support our channel. We will continue to provide in-depth analysis and the latest updates on global issues. Leave your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned with us so you don't miss out on upcoming videos.